Imagine being placed in a room the size of a parking space. No windows to the outside world. No conversation. No human touch. The lights never fully go off. You eat alone. You exercise alone. You exist alone for years, sometimes decades. This isn't a thought experiment. This is Tuesday at ADX Florence, the most secure federal prison ever built on American soil. And the weapon they use isn't a baton or a taser. It's something far more precise, far more lasting. It's silence. The United States Bureau of Prisons calls ADX Florence the end of the line. Inmates who arrive here have typically already proven they cannot be controlled anywhere else in the federal system. Terrorists, cartel bosses, serial killers, gang leaders who run empires from their cells in other prisons. ADX was built specifically for them. But here's what the design documents don't tell you. What the official tours don't show. What even the courts have struggled to confront. The silence itself, engineered and forced, unrelenting, does something to the human brain that no one fully anticipated. And decades of documented testimony, psychiatric evaluations, and federal lawsuits have slowly pulled back the curtain on exactly what that looks like. What you're about to hear is not speculation. It comes from court records, congressional testimony, former warden accounts, and the words of the inmates themselves, including some of the most dangerous men in American history who say ADX didn't just cage them, it changed them in ways no one can fully reverse. Stay with this until the end, because the final chapter raises a question that no one in the Bureau of Prisons has been able to answer. If you've never heard of ADX Florence, you're about to understand why it exists, and why some of the world's leading human rights organizations say it may have gone too far. Subscribe if you're new, hit the bell, and don't go anywhere, because the story only gets more complicated. To understand what ADX Florence does, you first have to understand why it was built. Before ADX existed, the federal prison system operated under the assumption that maximum security facilities were sufficient for even the most dangerous offenders. Alcatraz had closed in 1963. Too expensive to operate, too isolated from the mainland. Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois took its place as the toughest federal facility in the country, but Marion began showing cracks almost immediately. In October 1983, two correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were stabbed to death inside Marion on the same day by members of the Aryan Brotherhood. The murders were coordinated, planned, executed with weapons fashioned inside the prison. The killings sent a direct message to the entire federal system: even your most secure facility is not secure enough. Marion responded by locking down the entire institution. Every inmate confined to their cell for 23 hours a day. Programming suspended. Group meals ended. The lockdown, intended as temporary, lasted for years. Marion had essentially become a prototype not by design, but by necessity. The Bureau of Prisons took note. If the system needed a permanent solution, a facility designed from the ground up to neutralize the most dangerous inmates in America, they would have to build one from scratch. Ground broke in Fremont County, Colorado in the early 1990s. ADX Florence opened in November 1994. The architects and prison administrators who designed it had one guiding principle: control through environment. Every physical element of the facility was engineered to minimize human contact and maximize surveillance. The cells measured approximately 7 by 12 feet. Furniture was built directly into the concrete: the bed, the desk, the stool, all immovable, all part of the structure itself. A single narrow skylight angled so inmates could see only sky, never the yard or another human being. Admitted the only natural light. The plumbing could be shut off remotely by guards if an inmate tried to flood the cell. The doors operated electronically. Recreation took place alone, in a slightly larger concrete enclosure, sometimes described as a slightly bigger cell without a roof. Former warden Robert Hood, who ran ADX in the early 2000s, described it publicly as a clean version of hell. He wasn't being metaphorical. He meant it as a statement of design intent. Inmates at ADX were to have virtually no meaningful human interaction. That was the point. When the first inmates arrived in 1994, they included some of the most high-profile and genuinely dangerous individuals in the federal system. Over the following years, ADX would receive bombers, cartel leaders, spies, terrorists, and gang figures whose influence had stretched across entire prison systems. The logic was containment, not rehabilitation. Not punishment in the traditional sense. Containment. But containment, it would turn out, is not a neutral act. The human nervous system is not designed for the environment ADX created. And within a few years of the facility opening, the psychiatric community began documenting something that should have surprised no one, but surprised almost everyone. The silence was working, just not in the way anyone intended. The first major legal challenge to ADX Florence arrived in the form of a man named Thomas Silverstein. Silverstein was, by any documented measure, one of the most dangerous inmates the federal system had ever processed. He had been convicted of 4 murders while incarcerated, including the killing of Officer Merle Klutz at Marion in 1983, the same murder that triggered the lockdown that would eventually inspire ADX's creation. Silverstein had spent decades in conditions of extreme isolation, first at Marion, then transferred to ADX, held under a no human contact order that prison officials said was among the strictest ever applied to a federal inmate. By the time journalists and attorneys were able to document his conditions in detail, Silverstein had spent more than 2 decades in isolation. He described, in writings that were later made public through legal proceedings, a psychological deterioration that he documented with striking self-awareness. He wrote about losing the ability to track time, about conversations he began having with himself not metaphorically, but genuinely, as a coping mechanism, about visual disturbances, about the specific horror of silence that isn't quite silence, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant clang of steel, sounds that the brain begins to amplify in the absence of human voice. Silverstein died in 2019 at the age of 67, having spent 36 consecutive years in solitary confinement. His case is, in the words of the American Civil Liberties Union, one of the longest periods of solitary confinement in the history of American incarceration. But Silverstein was not alone, and the patterns his case documented were not unique to him. In 2012, a coalition of inmates and civil rights organizations filed a class action lawsuit, Cunningham v. Federal Bureau of Prisons, that documented conditions at ADX in systematic detail. The lawsuit alleged that the prison's psychiatric care was so inadequate that mentally ill inmates were routinely subjected to conditions that worsened their conditions rather than treated them. It alleged that inmates exhibiting clear symptoms of psychological breakdown, self-harm, delusional behavior, complete social withdrawal were disciplined rather than treated. The Bureau of Prisons settled the lawsuit in 2015. As part of the settlement, the BOP agreed to improve mental health screening and care, to create an internal review process for inmates with serious mental illness, and to transfer some mentally ill inmates away from ADX to facilities better equipped to handle their needs. The settlement was notable for what it did not include: no admission of wrongdoing, no concession that the conditions themselves were the problem. What the lawsuit did produce, however, was an extraordinary body of documented testimony. Inmate after inmate described the same progression: an initial period of adjustment, sometimes lasting weeks, sometimes months, followed by a creeping psychological pressure that manifested differently in different individuals. Some became hypervigilant. Others reported a progressive flattening of emotion, not peace, but the absence of feeling. Some described what psychiatrists who reviewed their cases identified as symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, emerging not from a single event, but from the sustained, unrelenting nature of their confinement. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School who has studied solitary confinement extensively and provided expert testimony in multiple federal cases, documented a specific syndrome in long-term isolated inmates: hypersensitivity to stimuli, perceptual distortions, difficulties with thinking and concentration, and in some cases, overt psychosis. His findings did not emerge from ADX specifically, but from studies of solitary Confinement across multiple facilities studies that courts have increasingly cited when evaluating conditions at ADX. The Bureau of Prisons has consistently maintained that ADX serves a legitimate penological purpose, that the inmates housed there represent genuine, documented threats that cannot be managed safely in general population settings. That position has never been successfully legally overturned, but the documented psychiatric consequences have made that position increasingly difficult to defend in public. Not everyone sent to ADX Florence arrived there because of violence. That is one of the facility's most documented and most contested features. Some of the most high-profile inmates at ADX Florence arrived there because of what they knew or what they represented, rather than because of what they had done inside the prison system. The logic was consistent. If an individual posed a threat to national security, or if their continued communication with the outside world could enable ongoing criminal activity, ADX was the solution. Art Hansen was one such case. Hansen, a former FBI agent, was convicted in 2002 of spying for Soviet and Russian intelligence over a period of more than 2 decades, described by the Department of Justice at the time as possibly the worst intelligence disaster in U.S. history. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms and sent to ADX, where he died in 2023. For the last 2 decades of his life, he was held in conditions designed specifically to prevent any further intelligence disclosure. The isolation was not punitive in the conventional sense. It was informational, designed to ensure that whatever else Hansen knew died with him inside that cell. Ramzi Youssef, convicted in connection with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and a global aviation plot, has been held at ADX for decades. Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber, is there. Zacharias Musawa, connected to the September 11th attacks, served time there. Terry Nichols, convicted for his role in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, is housed at ADX. The list reads like a catalog of American catastrophe, and that, in a sense, is the point. ADX was designed to be a place where the most symbolically significant and operationally dangerous individuals could be removed completely from any position of influence or threat. What it was not designed for, and this is where the documented record becomes most uncomfortable, was the inmates who arrived there not because they were irredeemably dangerous, but because the system had run out of other options. Court records and investigative journalism, including reporting by the Denver Post and the Marshall Project, have documented cases of inmates with serious mental illness being housed at ADX because other facilities could not manage their behavior, not because they posed the kind of threat the facility was originally designed for. Individuals whose severe psychiatric symptoms made them difficult to manage in general population settings, who cycled through disciplinary infractions that escalated their security classification until ADX was the only remaining option. This is the pipeline that critics have documented most forcefully, not the terrorists and the spies. Their presence at ADX is widely accepted as defensible on security grounds. It's the inmates who arrived at the end of the classification conveyor belt, swept there by a system that conflates unmanageability with danger. Former Bureau of Prisons Director Norman Carlson, speaking later in his career, acknowledged that the question of who belongs in a facility like ADX is one the system has never fully resolved. The original design intent, housing only the most genuinely dangerous individuals, has been strained by operational realities. The silence at ADX does not distinguish between a former intelligence asset and a mentally ill man who cannot stop flooding his cell. It treats both identically, and the documented consequences, according to the psychiatric record, are largely the same. We're halfway through the story, and the most disturbing part hasn't happened yet. What happens when the silence starts to fight back? Stay with us, subscribe if you haven't already, and keep watching. In 2016, then-President Barack Obama's administration called for an end to solitary confinement for juveniles in federal facilities and placed significant restrictions on its use for adults. The report accompanying that directive cited documented evidence that isolation causes lasting psychological harm and questioned its effectiveness as a tool for managing behavior. ADX Florence was not closed. It was not directly addressed, but the report marked a turning point in how the federal government's own language around solitary confinement had shifted from a neutral management tool to something requiring justification. That same year, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, known as the Mandela Rules, after Nelson Mandela, who spent years in isolation on Robben Island, formally defined solitary confinement lasting more than 15 consecutive days as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The United States helped shape those rules, but is not bound by them in domestic law. ADX. Inmates regularly spend years in conditions that meet that definition. The documented record of what prolonged isolation does to the brain is now substantial enough that it has moved from psychiatric literature into courtrooms and policy documents. The American Psychological Association, the American Medical Association, and the American Public Health Association have all taken formal positions opposing long-term solitary confinement on the basis of documented psychological harm. What makes ADX Florence's particular application of isolation distinctive and what the facility's defenders have consistently pointed to is that it is not uniformly permanent. ADX operates a step-down program. Inmates who demonstrate compliance over time can progress through a structured series of stages that offer incrementally more human contact, more programming, more access to education and work. The endpoint of the step down, in theory, is transfer to a lower security federal facility. In practice, the step down has been the subject of significant documented criticism. Human Rights Watch, in a 2012 report, found that the criteria for progression through the step down were often unclear to inmates, that mental illness could make compliance with those criteria effectively impossible, and that the process could be derailed by infractions so minor they would carry no significant consequence in any other correctional setting. An inmate could lose years of step-down progress for an incident that, in a general population prison, would result in a brief stint in segregation. Former inmate accounts gathered through legal proceedings, journalist interviews, and academic research describe the step-down as a psychological pressure system of its own. The carrot of eventual human contact and reduced isolation, perpetually visible and perpetually difficult to grasp. Some inmates describe the uncertainty of the criteria as more psychologically destabilizing than the isolation itself. Not knowing the rules of the game, you are required to win. One of the most thoroughly documented individual cases in this context is that of Jack Powers. Powers arrived at ADX after a series of violent incidents at other federal facilities. Court records document that he developed severe psychiatric symptoms during his time at ADX, symptoms that, according to medical testimony in subsequent legal proceedings, were directly exacerbated by his conditions of confinement. His case became central to the 2012 Cunningham lawsuit. Powers' documented deterioration described in clinical detail in court filings became one of the clearest illustrations available of what the facility's own mental health staff were observing and, critics argued, failing to adequately address. The Bureau of Prisons' consistent response to cases like Powers has been procedural, that mental health screening occurs, that treatment is available, that the system has mechanisms for identifying and addressing psychiatric deterioration. The gap between those assurances and the documented evidence of what actually happens to specific individuals inside the facility is where the legal, ethical, and psychiatric argument continues to play out. The silence at ADX Florence does not announce itself as a weapon. It doesn't need to. Here is the question that the documented record has never fully answered. Does ADX Florence make the United States safer? The Bureau of Prisons' position is yes, unambiguously. The facility has succeeded in its primary containment mission. There have been no successful escapes from ADX Florence in its 3 decades of operation. Inmates who previously coordinated criminal activity from other prisons directing gang operations, ordering violence, communicating with outside networks, have been effectively neutralized at ADX. The documented cases of cartel leaders and terrorist operatives whose operational capacity was severed by transfer to ADX support that claim. The counter-argument, drawn from the same factual record, is more complicated. Several inmates who passed through ADX Florence, including some who completed the step-down program and were transferred to lower security facilities, have subsequently been involved in violence or returned to criminal activity. The facility's own stated goal of behavior modification through environmental control has a documented mixed record when measured at the individual level. More significantly, the documented psychiatric consequences of long-term isolation raise an operational question that the Bureau of Prisons has not publicly confronted. If ADX Florence demonstrably worsens the mental health of a significant portion of its population, and if inmates are eventually released or transferred to less restrictive settings, what is being released? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a documented concern raised by forensic psychiatrists in federal court proceedings. Some inmates will spend the rest of their lives at ADX, and for them the question is ethical rather than operational. But for those who move through the system, and some do, the condition in which they arrive at the next facility, or eventually at the gate, matters. The documented record shows that former solitary confinement inmates have higher rates of recidivism, higher rates of psychiatric crisis after release, and greater difficulty with social reintegration than comparable populations who serve time in general population settings. Those findings come from multiple academic studies and have been cited in federal court proceedings. ADX Florence currently houses approximately 350 to 400 inmates at any given time. According to Bureau of Prisons data, it costs significantly more per inmate per year to operate than any other federal facility. Figures cited in congressional testimony have placed the per inmate cost at several times the average for standard maximum security prisons. The facility continues to operate. The step-down program continues. The lawsuits continue. The psychiatric literature continues to accumulate, and the silence continues. What is perhaps most striking, when you review the full documented record of ADX Florence, the court filings, the psychiatric evaluations, the congressional testimony, the inmate accounts gathered by journalists and researchers over 3 decades, is how little has fundamentally changed since 1994. The facility was built to answer a specific problem. 2 correctional officers were murdered at Marion. The system needed a response. ADX was that response. And measured purely by its containment function, it has never failed. But containment is not the only thing that happens inside those walls. The documented evidence of what prolonged, enforced silence does to human cognition, to the brain's capacity for social processing, emotional regulation, temporal orientation, is now extensive enough that it has cleared the threshold from contested claim to scientific consensus among the relevant professional bodies. The United States built the world's most sophisticated silence machine, and it works exactly as designed. The question the documented record leaves open, the question that no court has fully resolved, that no Bureau of Prisons report has honestly confronted, that no policy directive has adequately addressed, is this: what exactly are we designing for? If you found this story worth your time, the documented history of Pelican Bay State Prison is waiting. The system that helped inspire ADX Florence, the hunger strikes that changed American prison policy, and the question of whether any of it made anyone safer. That story is next. If this changed how you think about what prisons are actually for, share it. The documented record on solitary confinement in America is vast, and most people have never encountered it. Subscribe for the next chapter. We're just getting started.